Well, hi everyone, and welcome to a special edition of VLGA Connect from the summer series. Today, I'm joined by the CEO of the VLGA, Kathryn Arndt, for this conversation today. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, Chris. It's terrific to be here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for so long and really excited that we have the guests that we do today, but I'll let you do the introductions.
Well, I thought you were talking about having the conversation with me, but of course, I know that what you're really
Goes
excited
without
about
saying, Chris, goodness me.
is we're being joined by Associate Professor Tom Daly, Deputy Director of the Melbourne School of Government, for this topic of representative democracy today. Hi, Tom, and welcome to you.
Hi, Chris, and hi, Kathryn. Delighted to be with you today, and thanks for the invitation.
And Tom, you've been working on a project called How is COVID-19 Affecting Democracy? And that's sort of what we want to unpack a bit with you today. Can I start perhaps the conversation? I know Kathryn's got lots of thoughts and lots of questions, so I'll set her loose on you in just a second. But in terms of establishing the conversation, is it a fair premise that we can say the pandemic has affected or made us rethink how representation works in the democratic sense?
I think it really has, in the immediate sort of aftermath of the pandemic arriving, we've seen this huge shift of power from, two executives, two governments in terms of, taking on sweeping powers under emergency legislation, really leading the responses to the pandemic in a really rapidly changing policy environment. And that's really in many ways just changed how our governments are functioning right now. So you have, in many cases, parliaments are not operating in sort of their usual full tick at the federal level and at the state level in Australia. We have, in some cases, like Australia, we've had parliaments closed or really minimally functioning for very long sort of swathes of time. And at the local level, of course, we've had very severe impact in the sense of lockdowns, making it much harder for mayors and councillors to just do their jobs. And once again, that very quickly changing policy environment, sometimes leading to general managers and executive sort of managers taking on an even greater role than they'd been taking on before the pandemic hit. So all of that makes us stop and ask, what should our representatives be doing if certain parts of our government are actually locked down or not fulfilling their full role right now? What do we want them to do in general? Who should be at the table when difficult decisions, both big and small, are being made? And sort of how do we get to these governments that will look more closely like the communities that they serve? And those are all the big questions that I think they're not just happening in Australia, they're happening worldwide. But I think especially in a federal system, they come up in very particular ways.
And Tom, it's probably worth just pointing out that not just how these roles are carried out under these circumstances, but also at the heart of it is how people get elected to the roles in the first place. We've had that in Australia or in Victoria with council elections last year, and I know it's a hot topic in the UK right now. So, that's another element of it, isn't it?
It really is. And I mean, one of the big outcomes of the October council elections in Victoria was, in the run up to it, of course, we were very concerned that the mixture of lockdown, sort of, the impact on local media of COVID-19, all these kinds of constraints were going to advantage incumbents and actually disadvantage those who were newcomers, or especially from sort of diverse backgrounds and different demographics, like, female candidates versus male and so on. But we all had that surprise of the actual results bringing back, sort of much more diverse councils. We have sort of a record number of female councillors elected, 272 women across 76 councils. And it's now, almost 44% of councillors are women. And that's been amazing to see. I mean, we've been very closely connected to that here at the University of Melbourne, because of course we have the Pathways to Politics program for women. So we had, 17 alum or current participants actually running last year, and 6 of them were elected. And in one case, we even had one Pathways alum versus another Pathways alum. So you had this sense of people were very fired up. Rather than actually being disempowered by COVID, a lot of people have decided, I'm going to step up, I'm going to represent my community. People see the impact day after day that COVID has had on their community, and people from a lot of different backgrounds felt that in some cases there was nobody like them who was a voice at the table. And that's really important. Yeah, so it's I think that's been a huge sort of development in Victoria itself in the last few months.
I just wanted to unpack a couple of things there, and I'll start with what you were just talking about, and that was in fact the number of women that were successfully elected. And the VLGA, of course, was approached, as were other organisations in the lead up to the elections, by a number of groups or stakeholders calling for a deferral of the election. And we certainly, from the VLGA's perspective, didn't get caught up in that call for a deferral. We felt that there were, apart from the fact there were some very restricted legislative powers that would have enabled that to happen, we were very aware of the fact that there were members in the community who had been waiting for their opportunity to stand in these elections, and that our sense was that the results would not be as dismal as some were suggesting. So we were very pleased, and we were also, of course, running a number of programs to support increased diversity and the diversity of candidates standing in the elections. Just going back to your comment around the delegation of powers to the executive in this COVID pandemic environment, and I know through your governing during times of crisis policy briefs, there was a paper recently tabled that touched on, well, in depth, this issue. I'm wondering though, Tom, what your sense is of what the optics is of that for the general citizen. I mean, we can look at it from the elected representative perspective, and yes, we could acknowledge that there may be some elected representatives who feel a little disempowered, or they feel concerned that they're not having the voice that they feel that they should. But I'm wondering what the optics are for, the community member, the citizen who, is really just looking for leadership in a time of crisis.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I mean, we have this issue, of course, yes, of executives really taking the lead, and that's been really marked in Australia in particular. It's also, we've seen it in places like my home country, Ireland, where legal advice said we couldn't hold the parliament online, for example. But what's been really interesting to me is seeing that, and I wrote about this in one of the policy briefs for our Governing During Crisis series, was how there's been no public sort of disquiet in the sense of broader public outcry about Parliament being basically minimally functioning or not open at all for whole swathes of time, and being in general happy enough in a sense for executives to take the lead. I think that is a natural sort of reaction often from people. They want effectiveness, they want things to be done, and there can be a certain view that the only way you can achieve fast and prompt action is through sort of a single-led approach. But I think what it shows much more broadly is a certain disconnection between citizens and various levels of government, and that itself is resting on a lack of full knowledge about what is Parliament there to do for me, what is my council there to do for me. And I think that has allowed a sort of situation to arise, especially during COVID, where there is a lot of concerns about excessive centralization of the response. And when you look out to overseas experiences, whether it's Taiwan or UK or wherever, there has been a more broad-based response. Now in the UK, you can't say that they've had an enormously effective COVID response, but in Taiwan there has been. So it is possible to have your various government actors acting in concert, having greater scrutiny of the laws and so on and policies that are being produced by government, and that is responsive to public views and public sort of wishes in a more sort of organic way that isn't just based on electoral mandate and on your original sort of vote, whether it's a few months ago, a few years ago, or whatever. So I think that's a big question for the experts and for the sort of those in government, you know, because we have a certain view of how government should run. We tend to have more knowledge about how the plan is supposed to work. And so when it's working differently, like during a crisis, we are able to pinpoint what might be issues. But for your general citizen, I think there is a huge body of work that needs to be done in terms of reconnecting them to government. And in some cases, it's connecting them for the first time to certain levels of government, because, you know, you might just have whole communities where it just hasn't been a feature for quite a long time.
And look, on that very point, you know, local government, for example, has the lowest voter participation rates than any other level of government. I was pleased to see that the numbers increased a little bit in the last local government elections, but still certainly there isn't, or not all eligible voters are exercising that right to vote. We recently have been talking to a council that is actually under the control of administrators at the moment. And it was really pleasing to hear from those administrators that their work, they really want their work to focus on community capacity building and citizen engagement. And they want that work to start now, so that in 2024, when that community does have the ability to have a representative democracy again there, that there are candidates who fully understand the role and responsibility, but also a community that fully understands the role and responsibility of those candidates that they might cast a vote for. So I think that was really pleasing to see, and that's certainly an area that the VLGA has worked with other councils who've been in similar circumstances. When we consider the legislative governance responsibilities of elected representatives at the local government level, so councillors, is a representative democracy framework the best fit, keeping in mind the complexities that this framework brings with it in terms of campaigning on single policy or ward issues, partisan politics at times, the focus to be re-elected, and the understanding of, or lack of, which we've just touched on, of the voters and their understanding of the governance role of a councillor. And therefore, the ability for this framework to deliver effective local governance. Really interested in your views on that, Tom.
Once again, such an important question. And no matter what level of government you're talking about, it is such a big question, because we do have this sort of, you know, a legacy and a sort of traditional view of government as a sort of agent situation where we empower certain elected representatives to sort of, you know, to run with the ball, and they don't have to constantly be sort of asking us what we think between elections. But I think whether you're talking about the local level, the state level, the federal level, I think a lot of people are starting to ask, is that really an adequate model of, you know, government, where the framework is all about the representatives and, you know, the citizens only come in certain diffuse ways like public opinion polls and so on. And I think that's why, for me, you know, some of the experiments that have been rolled out in places like the UK are interesting, especially in response to COVID-19. So, you know, for the West Midlands Authority, for example, they set up a citizens panel to talk about what should a local recovery from COVID look like. They said, you know, they produced a report. It was 36 local citizens from a variety of backgrounds, all given a forum to just talk it out, talk about what are their priorities? What are their biggest concerns? And it was a way of adding a sort of a third dimension. If you think of the council as having its elected representatives, its executive sort of managers, this provides another sort of dimension of deliberation that is not just sort of every once in a while having a town hall, for example. So that's been interesting to me. And, you know, it's not just West Midlands in the UK. I think it was in Bristol, they had a sort of 3-stage process where they started with an online survey. And that sort of ran for a few months and finished in September last year. They then followed that up with an online discussion forum to sort of tighten up what were the key issues that were being brought up by sort of local citizens. And that sort of finished up with a citizens assembly, which has started sitting since mid-January. So you get this sense of, once again, this sort of trying to get citizens more involved, but in a way that it has enough structure that it's going to be able to provide, you know, genuine sort of recommendations and more precise recommendations that, you know, local government can act on. And I think, you know, it's not that there aren't sort of moves like this happening in Australia. I mean, Australia has a ton of democratic innovation going on. And, you know, some mayors have talked about not essentially having just citizens panels, for example, but having sort of open cabinet meetings, in the sense of, you know, citizens being able to come and actually ask their elected representatives about how money is being spent, how those decisions are being made. And I think, you know, when we're thinking about the recovery from COVID, how decimated so many sort of both metropolitan areas and regional areas are. And in some areas, of course, we have the sort of the double impact of the bushfires and COVID itself. I think being able to give people a voice, but not bypassing elected representatives, is a good way of thinking about what then would their role be. Because you're completely right. I mean, in the sense of, I should say, my grandfather was a local councillor in Ireland, and he used to complain about people's hobby horses. You know, they would come into chamber and they would still be banging the same drum over and over and over again, sometimes completely irrelevant to the matter at hand. And I think one of the big conversations that needs to be had at a sort of local government-wide level is, how do we act collectively in a more effective way? And I think if the elected representatives can figure out how to work better in a more collective way, but also in a way that's connected in it more clearly to citizens, I think that would actually make the most out of what elected representatives can do and be at the local level, and might allow for some sort of turn back of the trend towards ever greater control being handed over to general managers and to sort of, you know, the executive arm of local government. Because it's not that anybody is the bad guy in the situation, it's just you want to get the best balance, don't you, in terms of, you know, really achieving responsive, effective local government that really delivers on the kind of change that local communities want.
Tom, can we come back to the role of the councillor in all of this? How, you know, some councillors have been challenged by, what is my role? You've talked about the, I guess, the administration stepping up and taking more of the burden of getting stuff done under a COVID environment. But perhaps if we can focus in on mayors, and I wonder what sort of observations you have about how mayors have, I guess, grappled with what is my role in this pandemic environment, and whether there's any perhaps differences between a directly elected mayor as opposed to a mayor that's elected from amongst the councillors.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's been a really interesting question as well. I mean, you know, when we talk about what is representative government there to do, often the argument is, if you want greater sort of democratic legitimacy, if you want greater connection to the local sort of community, then directly elected mayors are the way to go. You know, they are also a way of sort of providing a center of gravity for local government and a way of channeling those disparate voices into something that is a bit more unified. But you know, I think we may see more calls for sort of directly elected mayors. I mean, we've already seen a report last year, calling for a directly elected mayor in Parramatta, for example. And we might see more calls in the context of the COVID recovery. You know, we need more sort of a direct connection between the local community and local representatives. But I think, no matter whether you're looking at, you know, local government in Australia or local government in a whole host of other countries, the same questions come up. You know, it depends very much on the individuals themselves, and especially, I think, when you have a newly directly elected mayor, especially if they have very limited powers, and that's often the case at the start, it very much depends on who is the first incumbent. What do they do with the role? How do they make the most of the role? And how do they do it in a way that doesn't sort of suck the oxygen out of chamber and bring it into the sort of mayor's office? So once again, it's more about balance. And I think if you can achieve something that achieves that balance, I think it's good to look at directly elected mayors from a gap filling point of view. Is there a gap there that needs to be filled, or are there other ways that you can achieve that sort of more responsive governance? I think it depends on the local council as well, whether it's big, small, whether, you know, what type of, area you're talking about, because different areas, of course, you know, it goes without saying, have their own sort of needs. And I think the biggest thing to avoid is just taking a sort of one size fits all, you know, in or out sort of response to whether directly elected mayors are a good thing or not. But I think, once again, you know, overseas experiences help again. You know, you see in the UK, for example, you've seen mayors really stepping up and becoming much more prominent in the sort of national political scene. You know, mayors from Manchester and Liverpool, for example, really strongly against the centralized approach to the COVID sort of management, and trying to push back against policies like seeking to return students to big university cities like Manchester and Liverpool. But despite all that prominence, when you actually look in the detail, those mayors still have very limited powers, especially compared to Mayor of London, for example. So, you know, I think a lot of it is trying to talk through, what do we need for any given area, and if we are going to go with a directly elected mayor, for example, do they need a lot of powers, or do we just need somebody who's going to be a sort of unifying force who can sort of push collaboration a little bit forward? A lot of questions, but I think you have to be very careful to the context.
Yeah, and look, of course, Chris, and you would have noticed this as well, we did see some local mayors, particularly in rural regional areas, becoming, I guess, a spokesperson for the community, more of a reassurance for the community that the executive had things in hand, that the council, to the best of their power and limitations, would be supporting them through the COVID pandemic. We did also see the issue of directly elected mayor come up in the Geelong investigators report, and there were strong recommendations against that model occurring again, and recommendations for the use of citizens' juries, which is similar to that citizens panel you referred to over in the UK. And I guess we should also just remind viewers that the UK, the scope and responsibilities of councils in the UK are far bigger than the responsibilities operationally that our Victorian councils have here. Certainly in Queensland, some of both the councils up there have significant responsibilities as well. So I guess all of that leads me to ask the question of, particularly when we look at the local government level, is the framework right? And if I could ask you another question, I guess, to sort of flesh that out a bit. We've seen it certainly in overseas. Estonia, I think, is a good example of the use of e-governance or digital governance. What are your views of the success of a digital governance in terms of its use as an enabler of the citizens to, I guess, directly participate or directly represent themselves in the processes of decision making as an alternative to representative democracy?
Once again, it is one of the biggest questions for governance, in countries worldwide, and certainly one that we're focused a lot more on these days at the School of Government as well. But I think it's one of these areas where design is everything and asking the right questions is everything. Because we've seen, especially sort of in the, turn of the century, sort of the early 2000s and so on, there was this sense of e-government is the next big thing. And there was a strong tendency to just shunt over a lot of government sort of operations into, digital delivery and so on. And sometimes that would disempower the citizen. It would give them fewer ways to actually have even human interaction, especially at the local government level. And I think, once again, the challenge for sort of this point onwards is we're dealing with, of course, more limited budgets. We're dealing with tech that has improved hugely, even just in the last 5 years. I think we're on the cusp of a huge radical change in how we use tech. But I think we once again have to ask, what are the gaps that we need to fill? And not take just a sort of just a broad brush approach that digital, being more modern, is better. Sometimes it's better being able to, just talk face to face. And I think we've all experienced that ourselves. Maybe we'll have fewer people wanting to add more Zoom to their lives after the worst of COVID is over. But I think, once again, if you have, for example, local communities that don't have great connection, or people who have mobility issues, if you have people in very remote areas, digital can really make a difference, for example. If you have capacity issues at your local council in terms of getting certain things done, effective and canny use of digital technology can up your capacity if you're very clear and precise about what it is you actually need it to do. So I think this is another one of those areas, I think, where training is going to become really important as well, because we have, of course, the framework for training under the Local Government Act, and of course it had to be done online last year. But as it sort of is rolled out in a different way in 2021 and onwards, I think some greater understanding of digital as well and what it can do for a local council could be really useful as well, in terms of just sort of getting towards that greater specificity in terms of what councils want and need, and what the local communities want and need. Because there's never going to be a full replacement of that human interaction, especially at the local level. But it can do really sort of transformative things if you're very clear on what you need it to do.
In terms of the work that you're doing, and we mentioned the project, how is COVID-19 affecting democracy? Where does all this lead for you?
I think one of the biggest sort of things is people often ask me, when are you going to finish this project? And I often say, when I, pop my clogs. But I think it is one of these areas where, whether you think that democracy is in big trouble at any level or in any country, or whether you just think sort of, it needs a bit of tweaking, democracy at every level is just, it can't work unless we're constantly rethinking how we do it. Democracy isn't something we have, it's something we do, it's something we practice, and we can always do it better. And I think that's certainly what's interesting to me is the speed of change you can achieve at the local level. You know, when you see that sort of the representativeness, even on the gender level, at local government in Victoria is, you know, outstrips the state parliament and the federal parliament, and it's moving in a very strong direction. That gives you a sense of, you know, that change is really possible, and local government can be a leader in terms of being representative in ways that are not just the sort of very mechanical process of campaigned on one issue and I'm now in council and now I talk about that issue forever and a day. You know, it is a broader sense of what local government can do and how local government can be a real voice for the community, a real centre of gravity for the community as well.
We could talk forever on that. I think what we will do, though, of course, is share some links with this interview to the work that you've been working on, particularly your Governing During Crisis policy series, or anything else, Tom, that you would like to share. I think you're absolutely right when you talk about the opportunities for local government. I wonder, though, about the appreciation or receptiveness of that from other levels of government, who tend to see elected representatives at the local level the poorer cousin to some extent. And we could probably spend a whole other interview unpacking that. Also, I'd like to pick up your comments about e-governance and the use of technology. I think we've seen at a local level some really great ways that technology is being used to engage with ratepayers and the community, and that's as simple as social media and Facebook and someone reporting a pothole at the end of the street and getting a response straight away. So I think that's an excellent example of it working, and I think it provides other opportunities for even more broader engagement. But I also do see the risks or the gaps that could be there. And I know when the VLGA, in fact, Chris, you chaired this panel for us. It was an e-governance panel, an international panel that we ran as part of the IceGov conference at RMIT a few years ago. And what struck me when the presenter from Estonia was speaking, and he used the example of how, in his view, fantastic it was that no citizen had to complete a tax return anymore. It was simply pre-populated, and if the citizen didn't do anything with it, it would be submitted automatically, or there was an opportunity for them to make the changes that they wanted to. And I could see some risks with that in terms of the capability and capacity of the citizen, who might then be expected to be able to understand the information that was presented to them, or whether in fact they just didn't have the technology savvy to be able to do that online process, and potentially could be disadvantaged as a result of that. And you know, I think it does, however, give us the opportunity to look at the ways that we can do things in a more agile way. And you're exactly correct. Democracy is something that we do, and I think all individuals involved in it, whether we are a voter or an elected representative, need to, you know, have a good, strong think about and long think about our role in that.
Excellent. Well summed up, Kathryn. Tom, thank you very much for being with us and being so generous with your time, and best of luck with the work that you're doing. I'm sure there'll be more opportunities to explore more of those themes with you in the future.
Absolutely. And thank you again for having me.
And Kathryn, thank you for being part of this special discussion today, because I know it's one you're particularly passionate about, and we'll see you again soon on VLGA Connect.
See you then, Chris.
This has been a special edition of the VLGA Connect Summer Series. More to come very soon.